Okay, this is the second lesson in my lesson number 4, which involves socialization and social interaction. The last lesson we introduced the concept of socialization, defined it, explained the four main agents, uh, reviewed some types of socialization, then discussed the concept of the self and why it's important. Then we talked about Goffman's dramaturgical theory, and as you recall, his theory is based on the notion that we're all like actors on a stage, playing different roles, and also doing our best to control our appearances. Um, and there's a lot of detail there. I didn't think that was all that consequential, but today we're going to get to another theory. It's Peter Blau's exchange theory. I believe it has far more impact, far more significance. So basically, Blau's exchange theory it was inspired by economic analysis, largely supply and demand. Okay, fundamental concept in economics, and the idea is social interactions are not only about acting, putting on a face, putting on an appearance before a crowd. Goffman's dramaturgical theory. Human interactions also involves exchanges. Now, the type of commodities that are exchanged include things like love, friendship, companionship, even sex, help, information. Disinformation can be passed. Beliefs, whether they're true or not, can be passed. Ideologies, histories, resources exchanged. Labor, money, hate, fear, conflict, so emotions can be exchanged. Influence peddling. Now, in all exchanges, the principle of supply and demand applies. So, I'll briefly explain this to get a foundation framework. All right. So here's a supply and demand curve. All right. On the y-axis, you have price. On the x-axis, you have quantity of commodities. Right. And the classic way of analyzing this begins with price as a causal factor, right? So as price goes up, well, the supply goes up because more people want to supply it because you make a lot of money for it, okay? As price goes down, then demand goes up because the cheaper it is, well, more people want it, all right? Now, you don't have to view this in terms of price being the causal factor. You can view it as price being the effect. I think this makes more sense. So an alternative analysis is as supply goes up, right, there's more of it on the market, well then price goes down because there's so much that, well, it's easy to get. As demand goes up, it gets scarce, so price goes up, okay? Either way, that's how they relate, supply and demand. Now, there are many aspects of exchange in human interaction, but I only want to focus upon one, which is power in exchange, all right, which relates to the concept of leverage, all right. Now, a simple example that's a current issue is U.S. versus China trade relations, and what's kind of like a tariff, a little war. Now, in this current conflict, the U.S. definitely has the advantage, the leverage advantage, because China is far more dependent upon trade with the U.S. than the U.S. on China. China has far more to lose in the disruption of this trade than the U.S. So we have the leverage advantage, so to speak, right? Now, in the long run, continuance of a trade war is in neither of our interests, right? It'll be bad for not only our economies, both China and U.S., but also the world economy, which then influences both our economies. So it's not going to be good in the long run, but it could be a necessary thing in the short term if there is unfair trade practices. All right. So now power in exchange is based upon market power, either as a monopoly or a monopsony. Now, a monopoly is the power of a sole provider or supplier. Monopsony is the power of a sole purchaser. So what's a monopoly? Well, the classic, the common, I guess, knowledge definition is sole supplier. Right? You have a monopoly if you're the sole supplier of a thing, and everyone has to go to you for something, right? But really, the key to monopoly power is the ability to control price. So the formal economic definition of monopoly power is not sole supplier, it's the ability to control price. And you'll see as you go through these lessons on exchange theory that this is, in fact, the core of the issue. That's the bottom line, because if you can control price, you can control profits. Right? Now, monopoly power is the ability to control price as a supplier. Monopsony power is the ability to control price as a buyer. So if you're the sole buyer, you can have a lot of influence in determining price. You can play one provider off of another to get a better deal, right? You can say, we'll give you a contract. If you give us, we'll give you the whole shebang contract, if you supply at this price. Another example is early industrial revolution, when there were few industries, limited primarily to like textile was the huge one, right? With few industries, you had few purchasers of labor, so they can dictate price, and of course they're going to drive down wages. They can dictate wages, so they're going to drive down wages as much as possible. And people were pretty poor. All right, as a sole buyer, you can play one supplier off another and get the best price, or you get discounts, or you get kickbacks, whatever. Now, an example of an exchange, I'll give you one early on, is with a corporation called Aegis Corporation. It is a private military security corporation, or PMSC, based out of England. It's a British company. And the exchange was they orchestrated a coup in Zimbabwe. They overthrew the government in exchange for oil concessions, right? And so this is a classic neo-colonial methods for gaining control of foreign resources. And a key person who was involved in the coup, a key leader of the corporation, was Mark Thatcher, son of the esteemed Margaret Thatcher. All right. Another example by the same corporation was when Aegis Corporation was hired to orchestrate a coup in Sierra Leone in exchange, in this case, for mining rights. And in Sierra Leone, there's plenty of diamonds. All right, again, classic neo-colonial methods for gaining control of foreign resources. All right, we talked about neo-colonial methods in the last lesson. Now, this example, actually, there's a movie based upon this, and I'm not one for Hollywood history, but this is not bad. It's called Blood Diamond, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, and it depicts, what are commonly known today as the New Wars, right? And Sierra Leone, the conflict over there, it can be considered one of these new wars where you have a failed state. You have warlords trying to vie for power, fighting each other. There's constant war. There's use of child soldiers. Civil society breaks down. Production capacity is destroyed within the country, and there's heavy reliance upon the single resource. Now, warlords fight to control the chief resource. In this case, it was diamonds. In the case in Zimbabwe, it was oil, right? Western corporations like Aegis Corporation fuel the war. They feed the war with arms, ammunition, and they facilitate the extraction of whatever resource it is, right? Okay, so this is essentially the same as neocolonialism, and I'll just briefly show you this. This is what I covered in the last lesson. Here's old-fashioned colonialism. Here's the difference with neocolonialism. I'm not going to go into it. And we, United States, we didn't practice much colonialism. Although we expanded our country in the exact same manner that Europeans expanded into foreign territories. Same process, same economic system. However, we didn't practice formal colonialism with overseas territories, but we did practice a lot of neocolonialism, which involved support of dictators, often very brutal dictators. And here's just a very short list. We supported many, many dictators, very brutal ones. But I'm not going to get into that in this lesson. Okay, so bottom line is control of price can be attained by controlling either supply or demand, and this is power. For example, let's say you need a commodity badly, right? You don't possess it. Someone else does. So in that case, who has power, right? Well, of course, it's the person who possesses that commodity, right? So the question is, the natural follow-on question is, how can you turn the tables and so gain power in exchange? Well, there's five fundamental ways. One is you can find an alternative source of the supply. Another is you can eliminate or reduce your need for the other person's commodity. Third is you can find an alternative commodity to replace his or hers. You can acquire something the other person needs to improve your bargaining power in exchange. Or you can create demand, a need within the other person for a commodity you already possess. All right. So I give an example of a marriage example here, and let's say you have a newlywed couple, and for the first couple of years, their life in the bedroom is pretty healthy, right? But after a time, maybe the woman is getting a little bit bored and losing interest for whatever reason. But the guy, still, is very interested in relationships, right? But she's standoffish, she's not complying, and so what can he do, right? Well, one, he can find an alternative source of supply, right? So in this case, he can get a mistress, or he can go to prostitutes, right? Two, he can eliminate or reduce his need for the other person's commodity, right? So he can take cold showers and whatever, go to the gym a lot, three, he can find an alternative commodity to replace his, right? So maybe he goes and uses internet porn, or he finds a hobby or something else that occupies time and get his mind off of it. He can acquire something the other person needs to improve his bargaining position in the exchange. So maybe the wife really likes bling, so he buys bling and uses that as an exchange thing. Or third one is create demand need within the other person for a commodity you possess. Now we have a really good example here, so we'll just go on to some examples that are pretty, for the most part, pretty common knowledge. All right, so examples of five: creating demand within the other person for a commodity you already possess. So let's say some guy has some drugs and he wants to sell it at his schoolyard, right? So what he does is the drug dealer goes to the schoolyard and supplies kids with free samples of crack, right, or cocaine, whatever it is, to get kids addicted, right? Once they're addicted, he's created demand. So he's created demand for a commodity that he already possesses, right? Another example that is unfortunately too common is human traffickers or pimps. They get young girls addicted to a drug, maybe even forcefully addict them to a drug, and then use that addiction to drive them into prostitution. Another example is the British opium trade, which was a triangle trade. We talked about this in the last lesson, so I'll review it real quickly. Review the concept of arbitrage. Arbitrage is buying a commodity in one market where it's cheap, shipping it to another market where the market price is higher. Right? You make a profit above your transportation cost, right? In this case, you do it 3 times. So the triangle trade England was conducting historically, they were the first country to industrialize in textiles, for example, and they would manufacture, finished products and ship them to India, like cotton textiles, right? And, and then sell it for profit, right? Then with that profit, they would purchase opium and ship that to China and sell that again for profit, so they make a double profit, right? And with that profit, they would purchase tea, silks, porcelains, incense, and perfumes and whatever they get from China, and then they ship that back to England or other European markets and sell for a profit. Okay. Now in this triangle trade, so they make a profit, profit, profit. All right, but the key critical link was opium. All right, that solved a big problem with their depletion of silver, because China had a silver-based currency, and it was causing depletion of silver in England. So that was resolved once they found that opium, they can create demand for opium. So the critical link in this triangle trade was opium sales to China. The British had to create and sustain demand for opium through addiction. Right? Opium trade became so profitable, in fact, that the British government in 1833 rescinded the East India Trade Company's monopoly on the opium trade and took direct control. So the British government became the monopoly drug pushers, the monopoly dope dealers in opium. China then suffered, as a result of this, rampant currency drain. They started being depleted of their silver. All right. They also had rampant drug addiction, crime, poverty, death, all that stuff that goes with drugs. Lack of productivity of the population. And so the Chinese government sought to stem the devastation to their society by blocking opium importation. Well, as you can imagine, the British government was having nothing to do with that. They said no way, and they fought 2 opium wars to force opium into China. The first was 1839 to 42, 1856 to 60, and in both cases, the treaties that were acquired from this were highly, beneficial to England, and they actually also forced open more trading ports to exposing China to British trade. Okay, so one way they gained power was through creating demand. Another, well, in 2 ways, right? Creating demand for drugs and creating demand for a cessation of, killing in warfare. I mean, that's what war's all about, right? You have a monopoly on the cessation of the violence. All right. So a 4th example is a CIA-run opium heroin operations in an area in Southeast Asia called the Golden Triangle, which involves Burma, Laos, and Thailand. So here's Burma over here. You can't really see it. I think it's called Myanmar now. Laos is over here, and here's Thailand, right? So that's like the triangle. All right. Now, this was conducted largely during the Vietnam War era, but also beginning in Korea, as we'll see down here. All right, so we'll review the Vietnam War. Now, if you recall from our lesson number 1, that in order to fight the Vietnam War, to call up a draft, to have boots on the ground in Vietnam, not just special forces advisors, but regular military forces on the ground in Vietnam, and all the massive appropriations bills to finance the war. For these things, there had to have been a legal basis, right? The president can't just do this on his own. So what was the legal basis, and how did they get it? Well, as you recall, it was a Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and I don't know if you remember any of the planning that was done, any of the actions that were done to manufacture the incident, including, a lot of threat signals plus actual attacks. I'm don't want to get into that again, but that's how they got the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is the sole legal basis for the war. The entire war was based upon that. Right? Now, at the same time, we fought parallel wars in Laos and Cambodia. There's Cambodia, here's Laos. Now, these wars did not have a legal basis, so there was no means of financing these wars. All right? So the question is, how do they get the money to finance it? Right? And they got it through the drug trade. All right? So here's the Golden Triangle. It's a triangle trade. And now, U.S. involvement in the heroin trade began in the early 1950s during the Korean War, right? And this is pretty much common knowledge, although I know Americans will lie and deny it. You know, a lot of Americans will not want to believe it, so they won't, right? It's so common knowledge that, in fact, there was a movie made about it called Air America, right? It's starring Mel Gibson and Robert Downey Jr. It was kind of a comedy, kind of a farcical thing, making fun of the whole thing. So Air America was one of two CIA front companies transporting food, drugs, and weapons. All right. The other one was Civil Air Transport. Now the CIA conducted a classic triangle trade. All right. Here's some sources you want to look at. There's plenty of sources. This is very readily available. Now, in this triangle trade, you had Golden Triangle peasants growing opium. The key molecule in opium is the morphine they extract, and then they're sent to labs where that morphine is acetylated, a simple chemical process, and from that, morphine is converted into heroin, which is many, many times more potent than morphine, and then they sell the heroin. So the CIA is helping out at the labs, transport, selling it. They're also helping out with laundering the money, right? And the drug money was laundered through a CIA-run bank called the Guggenheim Bank, based out of Australia. And with the money they gained, they purchased weapons for the warlords to fight the communists in unauthorized wars. And they also purchased food provided to the peasants who were busy growing opium instead of food. All right. Now, the key to maintaining power was to maintain dependency. If villagers tried to grow their own food, the CIA would defoliate local crops with Agent Orange, so that the villagers were forced to produce opium as a cash crop to buy food. Right. So that forced them to grow opium. Dependency meant control, and control is power. All right. Now, the bank that laundered all the money was another CIA front company called the Guggenheim Bank. It was staffed by CIA officers, including William Colby, who was CIA's Vietnam station chief during the Vietnam War, and later became director of the CIA, the top person in the CIA. And it was also staffed by retired generals and admirals. Okay, so that was the Golden Triangle in the 60s and 70s, 50s through 70s. Now, there is also evidence of that drug money was again used to support the Contras in Nicaragua. You know, the whole Iran-Contra controversy, right? I read the Iran-Contra investigation report, the Senate report. Now, in this case, though, there's no definitive evidence of direct U.S. involvement in drug trafficking, as it was here, right? There's only the testimony of Fabio Ernesto Carrasco, a pilot for drug dealer Jorge Morales, who flew over 5 flights between Costa Rica and the United States, carrying drugs to the U.S. and then weapons to the Contras, under the belief that his flights were authorized by the CIA. So that's it. He believed it, right? That's not much to go on. Right? However, it is known that the Iran-Contra report states that it was known by these U.S. government officials, Reagan administration officials, knew the Contras were drug dealers. Reagan administration officials knew drug money was being used to finance the war against the government. They also knew that the Contras were selling both drugs, not only drugs, but also the weapons they acquired right? Because they're making profit off the weapons, weapons that were supposed to be used to fight the what were they, Sandinistas, I guess, um, which were weapons that were illegally supplied to them by the Reagan administration. This was against the law. I forget the law that was passed to prevent this, but they violated this law. The Contras used extreme violence. They used U.S. counterinsurgency methods, which were extremely brutal. Employing death squads, and there are a number of incidents where whole villages were slaughtered. I mean, I've heard testimony of a mother who while the whole entire village was being rounded up, she escaped off to the side and hid in the bushes, and she had to hide there quietly as her children were screaming out for her name for help, pleading before they were slaughtered. It must have been horrible. The Reagan administration illegally sold weapons to Iran. They purchased weapons for the Contras. And we'll talk more about this. And you have to wonder, why didn't they just supply weapons to Iran? Why did they take illegally complex weapons, TOW anti-tank missiles and Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, and sell them to Iran? Why didn't they just take small arms, machine guns, and rifles and so forth, and mortars, and give them directly to the Contras? So we'll talk more about that later. So, I mean, it's part of the craziness of the Cold War, where we supported brutal, corrupt dictators like Somoza, and then later the Contras, who were just corrupt, drug-dealing, brutal people, right? In the name of fighting communism, anti-communism, when in fact a core to communist ideology is Western support for brutal puppet dictators just like this, right? So we're playing into their narrative, communist narrative, right? In a sense, you could say we're fueling communism. Anyways, part of the craziness, irrationality of the Cold War. All right, now another example of an exchange is someone can plant an idea or image or incident in your mind. Now, I've showed you many detonators how this was done, right? Without you knowing you're being influenced and manipulated. Does that person have power over you? Especially if you don't know. Well, of course you don't know if they can do it. And is an exchange being conducted? Well, absolutely. But if you're not aware of it, do you have any power in exchange? Do they have power? Absolutely. Can that be done? Now, I say here, remember all the trees that I taught you? Do you remember what trees are? Elements that are intentionally planted in cognition to alter the way you see other things, right? And they're planted, with timing and so forth, right? One example of trees are detonators, and I showed you a number of detonators, about a dozen. Now, can the media plant images and ideas in your head? Can movies do it? Can TV? Can news media? Can the government? What about weapons of mass destruction? Was that planted in your head? What about the idea that Iraq was behind 9/11? Was that planted in your head? Did a lot of Americans believe that? Yeah. I have your American Sniper extra credit. We went through that movie and how that movie was just chock full of untruths, just made up stuff. A fairly recent example that used all the above methods to try to turn the tables, right? Here's the last example I'll give you is oil, all right? Now, the background is U.S. oil production peaked in 1970, right? From there, it was all downhill until fracking came in. So this shows U.S. oil production. This is continental production here. It peaked in 1970. That's 1970. Then this is Alaska oil, kind of kicked in a little bit, helped buffer the descent, all right? But that tapered off as well. But then fracking kicked in, and now fracking, we're above here. We're above our max capacity back here. We're now the biggest producer of oil in the world because of fracking, new technology. All right, now in 1971, U.S. oil demand exceeded production capacity. So what happened in 1971 is the Texas Railroad Commission set pro rationing at 100% production capacity. So here's just an example. If this is your production capacity, as much oil as you can produce, which is right here, right? That's going up and then going down, right? By 1971, all right, production, which is roughly meeting demand, is at 100% capacity, right? So when production is below total capacity, you have some spare production capacity. With that spare fudge factor, you can raise production to lower price. You can lower production to raise price, all right? So with that, you can control price. Now, in 1971, when we're pumping out as much oil as we can, and we're still not meeting demand, we can no longer control price. So OPEC took over as a monitor of spare production, right? This means OPEC now controls price. And as we said above, the ability to control price is the essence of monopoly power, all right? All right, now in 1973, there was the Yom Kippur War, and we supported Israel. Because of that, OPEC embargoes oil to the United States. Oil prices in the United States immediately quadruple. They go up 4 times. And this killed our economy. Oil then is realized and used as a weapon, right? Then just 6 years later, in 1979, the Iranian Revolution occurs. Iran oil production plummets and oil prices triple. So the effect was in the span of 6 years, oil prices went up 12 times. For example, if oil was at $5 a barrel before this, 6 years later, it's $60 a barrel. Right? Now, the massive 12-time increase in oil price killed the U.S. economy. It caused inflation, which caused a recession, and the combination of inflation and recession is called stagflation. So this is an inflation-driven recession, all right, which is kind of the worst of all worlds. All right. Typically, you get inflation when the economy is doing great. As economies, firing in all cylinders, you have high demand for resources, including labor. That causes scarcity of resources. That causes prices of goods to go up, right? Including wages. If we're at near full employment, and there's few people available to fill jobs, well, you're going to have to increase wages to attract the people to take those jobs. So wages go up, and that's a big cost factor. That's a big price input factor. Now, but that's where the economy. You're not even getting it in this case. You're getting inflation due to an outside source, and that's causing recession. So this is the worst of both worlds. All right. Now, also by this time, by 1980, the Western industrialized nations lost all direct control over foreign oil. So most of these oil production areas were developed by the major Western industrialized oil corporations. But by the 1980s, they nationalized most of that. They took over control of their own oil. So we lost control of foreign oil. Now, oil is the single most important material resource for modern industrial economies. All right, we'll get to that here. But before we do that, I say I'll elaborate more on it here. Before we do that, I want to show you a paper written by a guy named Admiral James Woolsey, who was a former director of the CIA. The paper's called "Destroying Oil's Monopoly and OPEC's Cartel." All right, here he is, guy here, retired admiral, director of the CIA, and currently he's a member of the board of Genie Energy. And interesting fact is, if you look at who else is on the board, but Genie Energy was highly involved in developing Golan Heights oil. Golan Heights is a territory that was part of Syria, which was acquired by Israel during the Six-Day War in 1967. And they discovered that it had oil reserves, right? So Genie Energy was going to develop it. They were doing studies, geological studies. Unfortunately, they found out that it didn't have sufficient oil reserves to really warrant the investment, right? But all this movement was occurring when Syria is going through its civil war. I mean, Syria is still going through its civil war, and you have to think, you have to know in your head that the reason why they're making this big push for Golan Heights oil is because they know that with Syria locked in a civil war, that's going to weaken Assad, right? Now, if Assad was not at war, there stood a better chance that if they developed Golan Heights oil, it could be at risk for Syria wanting to take it back. I mean, Syria, both Assads, his father and the current Assad, both of them still want to regain control of the Golan Heights. So the current conflict in Syria was actually beneficial to this corporation. Anyways, this is what he says in his paper. As a distinguished free market economist, Frederick Hayek stressed, and in similar words, Adam Smith and Milton Friedman did as well, monopolies and cartels are the major enemies of free markets. Destroying them should be the first priority of those in government who want their societies to have the advantage of a market economy. Yet we have lived for decades with our entire transportation system dominated by cartel, OPEC, nested in a monopoly, oil. Together they undermine our ability to let the free market respond to increased demand for transportation fuel via market mechanisms. The market is not permitted to work adequately to increase the supply of fuel to limit the price we must pay for oil. Right? Remember, control of prices, monopoly power. Thus, oil's monopoly over transportation and the cartel's control of a huge share of oil production, which is roughly around 40% of world production, together increasingly threaten our economic viability, our national security, and the stability of many other nations in the world as well. So these are all linked together. Economic viability, right, is the basis of our national security. Right? Economic viability determines whether your society is stable or not. Whether there's unrest, and people in the streets protesting. And well, look at France, where there's just a little bit of a tax thing. And all right, so oil is a huge part of this economic viability, right? And that's what Woolsey says. So he says because of this, we got to destroy OPEC. Right? Destroying them should be the first priority of those in government. Well, how do you destroy OPEC? That's what we're going to get to in upcoming lessons. But today what I want to do is emphasize on the importance of oil and factors that control oil price. So why is oil so important to the economy, to the world economy, to our economy? Right? Why is it strategic? We'll see more why it's strategic when we get to Winston Churchill in 1911. We'll get to that in the next lesson. But for now, I want to say this, that industrial economies have been built upon oil because they're largely based upon commerce or trade. Right? Commerce or trade requires transportation. All right? Now, for example, there's a local community I'm kind of familiar with, a little town nearby, about an hour away, called Greenville. It's a farming community, very small town, not much there, right? Now, let's say the area, the farmers, the soil, the climate, whatever is good for growing turnips. I'm not sure what they grow actually over there, but let's say they grow turnips. Now, can that community support itself by eating all the turnips that they grow? Well, no, right? They grow far more turnips than they can eat, so they have to sell it. They sell it for a profit, right? That's how they make their income. So this requires transportation. It has to be shipped out to the surrounding area. All right. Another example is the Maytag washer dryer company factory in a small town called Newton, Iowa. All right, 15,000 population, very small. All right. Now, can the people of that town purchase all the Maytag dryers and washers themselves? No. They build them and they export them out. They ship them out to make a profit, right? So industrial economies are inherently dependent upon transportation, right? Now, transportation, the importance of it goes way back to what you were talking about, arbitrage, going to the ancient Phoenicians and controlling trade routes and all that. Now, transportation today is based upon oil. That's our technology today. So our economies are dependent upon oil. Now, not only is oil used for transportation, but oil is the basis of the entire synthetic chemistry industry, the organic chemistry industry. Now, when I say organic, I mean carbon-based. So, the popular definition of organic means, well, it's natural, without, fertilizers and insecticides, whatever. Well, the real classic definition of organic means carbon-based, right? So, organic chemistry is chemistry in which you study how carbon bonds. All right, now just briefly, I want to show you why this is important because basically, if it's not made of steel, some sort of metal, glass, uh, ceramic, or a wood or something like that, it's made from plastic. So here's just a short list of products made from petroleum. It's 144 6,000 items. I mean, I'm sure the more and more items will be made, right? And well, okay, so pharmaceuticals. Every drug you take is made from oil. Oil is a base molecules from which you synthesize complex drugs. Upholstery, bicycle tires, vitamins, I don't know, dyes, umbrellas, roofing, speakers, tennis rackets, nylon, antifreeze, okay, dentures, toothbrushes, CDs, DVDs, candles, hand lotion, cortisone. These are drugs from what do we have? Cortisone, antihistamines, food preservatives, all right, ballpoint pens, carpet, fishing rods, on and on and on. All right, any pharmaceutical, basically anything you find in your bathroom except for toilet paper is made from oil, or maybe the metal rods, for towel holders, but anything ceramic, but anything in your medicine cabinet, is made from oil. Whether it's perfumes or makeup or I don't know, shampoos, soaps, antihistamines, and toothpaste, and everything. Okay. um, so oil. So because of that, oil is very important. Oil has a lot of uses. It's a basis, the foundation of industrial economies, right? It's a foundation of building materials, right? And as the price of oil increases, well, that's a big inflationary factor, right? So oil is a huge inflationary factor, right? Now, when you have inflation, that means prices are rising, right? When prices are rising, that means the value of currency is falling. Your dollar can buy less, right? So if you have a set money supply, if currency values fall due to inflation, you have a real decrease in the money supply. Now, this is not good, especially if you want a growing economy. If you have a growing economy, right, you want the money supply to increase. If it doesn't increase in conjunction with your growing economy, then you're going to get a shortage of currency, and that's going to cause deflation. Well, what happens is it's going to cause a scarcity of currency, and that's going to increase the price of obtaining capital. The price of obtaining capital is interest rates rise, right? Now, another way of looking at this is, if you have inflation, if a person is going to be willing to put money in a bank, well, the bank's going to have to pay an interest that's above the inflation rate. For example, let's say the inflation rate is 10%. Well, if banks are paying 8%, you're losing money. You put your money in the bank for a year, you're getting out less real amount than you put in. So why bother putting it in? So as inflation goes up, well, then banks are going to have to increase their interest rates. But as interest rates rise, it's more and more difficult for people to buy big ticket items like homes and cars. Right? Mortgage payments are going to go up. Car payments are going to go up. People are not able to afford them. They may hold off purchases. Well, that's not good for the economy. Also, new investment, building new production capacity is going to be slowed down, right? So economic activity slows, growth slows. You get a recession or depression, and then when you have a recession or depression, well, economic activity slows, income decreases, consumption falls. There's decreased demand for oil. Oil prices fall. But then what happens? So oil prices fall here. But then what happens is you have a combination of decreased price for oil and decreased demand, and revenues for oil-producing nations fall. For example, this occurred in the 80s, 98 with the Asian crisis, '08 with the housing crisis, mortgage crisis. Therefore, it is in the interest of oil-producing nations to maintain production at levels that support a growing world economy. And this is what was learned by Saudi Arabia in the 1980s. We'll cover this in a little bit. Right? By the 80s, they had this figured out. So, in other words, getting greedy and restricting production to increase prices and profits backfires. Right? You shoot yourself in the foot, in a sense. All right. So the bottom line is, oil has a huge impact upon our economy, whether as the fuel for transportation, which is the basis of commerce and thus our economy, or as a fundamental building block for the chemical industry, right? Now the question is not, what is made of oil? The better question is, what isn't made of oil? Well, like I said before, if it's not metal, wood, glass, ceramic, it's probably made from oil. So let's do a quick review of this, and we'll elaborate a little bit more. So why is oil so important? One, fossil fuel for energy and transportation, for home heating, also commerce and the economy. A cheap source of readily usable hydrocarbon chains, all right? So all these organic life, right, were broken down. Basically, the earth did the work. So now they're broken down to simple, readily usable hydrocarbon chains, which serve as the building blocks for the synthetic chemistry industry. All you have to do is what's called fractional distillation. Divide out the different lengths of chains, which have different uses, and lighter chains are used for gases, for example, butane, so forth, right? A little bit heavier are used for gasoline, a little bit heavier still diesel, and then jet fuels, and then kerosenes and whatnot, right? Then motor oils. Now, why is carbon the basis of organic chemistry, life, and the synthetic chemistry industry? Right? The reason why carbon is so important is because of its versatility. You can make virtually any molecule you want with carbon that you can think of. So carbon, one reason why is carbon has 4 valence electrons. Right? Recall that there's a rule in chemistry called the octet rule, where elements become stable when they get a full 8 electrons in their outer shell. That's the octet rule. Now, carbon has 4 valence electrons, which means it needs 4 more. That means it needs to make 4 bonds. Now, with 4 bonds, that's the most bonds you typically need, to make, an element can make with covalent bonds. And because of that, it can make single bonds like these. It can make double bonds and single bonds, like this is benzene, a 6-carbon ring. It can make triple bonds, all right? So it makes a large variety of bonds. And another factor is carbon has an electronegativity of 2.5, right, which is right smack in the middle. The lowest electronegativity, and electronegativity, by the way, means attraction for electrons, is cesium, a metal here, right? Fluorine, a halogen, has the highest at 4.0. So 0.7, 4.0. Carbon is like right smack dab in the middle, just about. All right. And as far as attraction for electrons, in this low attraction, metals tend to have low attraction. That's why they're good conductors of electricity. They give them up easy. They let them pass. They pass them on. So let those electrons flow. Now, electronegativity ranges from 0.7 to 4.0. Carbon with 2.5 is pretty much right smack dab in the middle. Now, the difference between the electronegativity of carbon and fluorine is 1.5. 4 minus 2.5, right? And this results in a covalent bond. When you have covalent bonds, you get molecules. Molecules are discrete particles with very specific properties that do not dissociate in water, non-dissociable, I say. So, for example, ionic bonds like salts, right? You put them in water, they melt. They dissolve in the water, and they lose their structure. Not so with molecules. They maintain their structure and they maintain their properties, right? That's why they're very important. Now, electronegativity difference is less than 1.67, right? And carbon fluorine is 1.5. The biggest difference here, 1.5, right? If it's 1.67 or less, you get covalent bonds, which means you get molecules. With electronegativity difference greater than 1.67, that means electrons are transferred and you get ionic bonds, which gives you salt crystals, minerals, all right? Now, molecules are discrete discrete particles with very specific properties, often uh, highly specific properties. For example, enzymes, cell signaling molecules, which we'll talk about down here. Now, the idea of the versatility of carbon is molecules are like words, and the elements are like letters. So the idea is, just as like in language, with 26 letters, right? You can make an infinite amount of words. You can make an unlimited amount of words, anything you can think of, so long as there is a concept, right? That's a basis for it. Same thing with carbon molecules. You can make up an infinite variety of molecules that can serve all sorts of functions, so long as you're creative. So with an electronegativity of 2.5, carbon makes covalent bonds with just about anything, including the most extreme, fluorine, right? Highest electronegativity, right? So it's going to make a covalent bond with fluorine, and you get what are called chlorofluorocarbons, right? Things like Teflon, Freon, all right? Also, example here is radioactive glucose, which is a marker for cancer cells, and the idea here is you have radioactive fluorine, which gives off probably gamma or beta, or I'm willing to bet it's gamma radiation. So the fluorine itself has a property of stabilizing carbon rings, so it's called ring stabilization. And the idea is if it's ring stabilized, then enzymes can't break this down. All right. So cells that uptake this cannot break it down. It cannot eliminate it. They keep it within the cell, and it continues to give off radiation. Now, the cells that uptake the most have the highest metabolism, and those cells are cancer cells, which have metabolism out of control. So they load up in these radioactive glucose molecules. All right, they can't break them down, so they stay there and they give off the radiation. So if you take a radiograph of the person, right, you're going to see, the person lighting up like a Christmas tree. All the spots that have cancer are going to illuminate bright, so you can identify the cancer location. All right, So that's an example of fluorine bonding with carbon. Usefulness of that. Fluorine can bond with metals. For example, steel is a alloy of carbon and iron, right? And other metals bond with carbon via what's called the carbonyl process, which is shown down here, all right? And like I said, carbon is so versatile, it's the basis of life. So because of carbon's diversity of types of bonds and the fact that it can bond covalently with just about any other element, this allows carbon to form an unlimited possible number of molecules in all the multitude of molecules that are needed to support life. And this is why we are considered carbon-based life forms, right? Let me just give you two examples. One is a cell signaling molecule, which I mentioned up here. Another is an enzyme. All right. If you look at these are actually made of countless numbers of atoms. Right. They're protein chains. Each protein has many atoms. Right. There's many proteins. Now these molecules are in highly specific, exact conformations or shapes. Right. The sequence in which the different proteins combine creates electron valence structures, which shape this molecule to a very specific shape, and because of that, this acts like a signaling molecule on the surface of a cell, without which that cell cannot function. Right? Another example is an enzyme. These are highly complex molecules, proteins, many, countless amino acids, right, in a very specific, exact shape. Right? Usually it has an active site somewhere like in here, and it pulls in this, like for example, let's say this is amylase, an enzyme that breaks down sugar, right? That sugar molecule will be attracted and fit in, lock in place in exact conformation, and then will be broken apart to use for digestion, for metabolism, right? Due to this enzyme. Without these enzymes, our chemistry wouldn't function. We wouldn't function. Another example is graphene. I think graphene has potential to be a new wonder material. All right, what graphene is, it's got this sp2 hybridization where you typically have one s and three p orbitals, right? One of the s and two of the p's hybridize together to give you three sp2s. You have one unhybridized p orbital here, right? These bond together, right? Very strong bonds in a two-dimensional lattice like this, right? That's in a plane. Now, the p orbital, which is unhybridized, holds electrons very loosely, so they're free to flow across this pattern, right? Now, they're so free to flow that graphene has amazing properties. It's 100 times more conductive than metals. It's super conductive, right? At the same time, it's 200 times stronger than steel, right? Also, the thin layer, it's transparent. It doesn't absorb light, right? So there's a lot of potential for this to be an integral part of solar cell windows. Windows which conduct electricity through the glass and produce power, which you can see right through. Once they get this technology rolling, then virtually every building, every skyscraper is going to be a big power generator. All right, oil plays a part in every single product, if not in manufacture, then in transportation. So let me give you an example of ground beef, right? So how much oil is in ground beef? Well, you go to the store, you go buy, a pound of ground beef, whatever, right? You want to make some burgers. You get the styrofoam container, that's all oil. The absorbent layer, made from oil. The clear plastic wrap on top, oil. Ink on the label, oil. Fuel for transportation. Fuel for refrigeration. Every vaccination, medicine, steroid given to the cattle. Fertilizer to grow the feed, fodder, grain, right? Made from oil or natural gas. Fuel for farming and transportation of feed. So, fuel for the farm tractors, right? Okay. Now, so there's so much oil all along the production process of ground beef, from cattle. Airplane cabin. You ever walk in an airplane? You look around. What in that entire airplane cabin is not made from oil? Everything is, right? From the carpet, foam seat cushions, from the seat covers, the fabric. If the seat fabric was not made from synthetic fabric, that would just wear out within a matter of a few months. Right, you have to keep replacing them. Plastic walls, overhead bins, the lights, switches, all those little things in the overhead, the air handle things. Seat handles, right? Windows are made from plastic. The only thing that's not made from plastic are the aluminum frames within the seats themselves. All right, so I want to show you the economic importance, and this is just a graphical representation, right? The economy is more complex than just oil. So here's likely attacks. Well, people are going to say the economy is more complex than just oil. Yeah, but still oil is undeniably a central factor. Another likely attack is, well, correlation doesn't prove causation, but it can be strong evidence, right? We talked about in lesson number 2 on the scientific method how this is true. Correlation does not prove causation, and one of the reasons is because you have other types of variables. You have antecedent variables, you have intervening variables, and you also have bidirectional relationships, right? And let me give you an example here. So if you have oil price being OP and economy econ, right? If oil price goes up, the economy goes down. There's a strong correlation for this. At least there was, in the 70s and 80s and so forth, right? I still think there is, but I believe that the impact of oil is decreasing as with economic growth in new products, which are not transportation intensive, right? We have a big chunk of the growing economy which is not dependent upon a lot of cost for transportation. For example, there's high value in electronic components and computer chips and so forth, right? Which are low weight, not very transportation cost intensive, right? As those continue to increase in relative volume, then the relative importance of oil can diminish. But in any event, oil is still important. So this is a very strong correlation. It's been proven. However, there's a weak correlation between oil price going down and the economy going up. And I believe this is because there's a bidirectional relationship. So as oil price goes down, the economy can go up, but as the economy goes down, oil price goes down. So these are opposing. One is inverse relationship. This is a direct relationship, right? And these cancel each other out, making this correlation weak. All right, now I want to show you an example of these correlations. Let's see here. Oh, let's see. Oh, that will work. Okay. All right, so here are historical price of oil. I think this is in 2010 prices, as I recall. It's consistent prices. Consistent dollar values, I mean. Um, okay, so here's oil prices going from World War II. This is shortly after World War II. This is the start of the Cold War, 47. And oil prices kind of tapering off a little bit, right? But then you had the 1973 Yom Kippur War, OPEC embargo, oil prices jacked up 4 times, right? Killed our economy. So then you had the Iran revolution, it jacked up again, right? So let's take a look what happened. So oil appears to be a key factor in inflation. This is inflation, and this is economic growth, right? So with oil prices going up, inflation jacked up. Boom. Oil price goes up, inflation jacked up, right? As oil prices go up, inflation jacks up. What does the economy do? Crashes, right? Same here. Crashes here, right? And oil prices. What's another thing coming here? Now, what happened here is the Iran-Iraq War started, and the Iran-Iraq War was actually very, very beneficial in lowering oil prices. Oil prices fell, and it plummeted at about 1985 or 86. It got rock bottom in 86 prices. It was $6 a barrel. There was a spot price of $6 a barrel in $86, right? And that's probably even cheaper than, back here in the 70s, whatever it was. Okay, so what else here? What else can I show you? There's the Gulf War here, spiking oil prices. You have inflation spiking, economy going down a little bit, right? You have this is the '98 Asian crisis, right? It was kicked off with a crisis in Thai currency, all right? And actually, in this case, this is the reverse. Remember, we said that it's bidirectional. In this case, the economy took down oil price. As economic activity lowered, demand for oil fell, and so lowered oil prices, right? U.S. economy was not affected by this that much. What else do I want to show you here? I should have. Well, I'll show you this one. So this is the housing crisis here, the 2008 mortgage crisis, and it killed our economy. Inflation dumped because no one has money to buy things. Things are cheaper because there's low demand. Right. Same with oil prices. Oil prices tanked. Right. So there seems to be a direct correlation between the economy and oil prices. All right. Okay, so oil price clearly has a large impact upon the world economy, though I believe less so to the extent modern economic growth is occurring in items that are not transportation intensive, like I said, like computer chips, electronic components, even just information that's not transported physically at all. It's transported through satellites or through cyber, right? So things of value which are not transportation dependent, right? And as those grow in importance, the relative importance of oil can diminish. So now, what factors can affect oil price? Let me make this a little larger here. I made this diagram. When I first made this diagram, I made it in less than an hour. I just threw it together. And this is pretty much most of it. I've tinkered with it a little bit, but this is essentially what I did in an hour. So we'll start here. Here's oil price. Here's kind of like the target. two main factors that affect it are supply and demand, as always, right? As supply goes up, oil price goes down. So it's a negative correlation there. As demand goes up, price goes up. All right. Now, so what factors can affect it? Well, first one we'll look at is national political considerations. And let's take a look at some possible political considerations we may have. I'm making a video here. Okay, so I'm back. Took a little break there. Wait. Okay. All right, so one of the factors that affects oil price are national political consideration. They don't have to be oil-producing countries. They can be just oil-consuming countries. Anyway, so you have certain political requirements, political needs, or policies, right? And I'll give you a couple examples here. One is sanctions against oil-producing countries, export restrictions, right? Maybe you have United Nations sanctions. Decreasing supply results in decreasing supply upon the market, which can raise oil price. Example I gave is the current Iran sanctions. All right. Well, I want to go beyond just the more recent one. For example, there were sanctions thrown on. I wonder where they were, like 2012 or so, right? And then they finally got the agreement in 2015, and the sanctions were removed. Well, Iran came back online as a producer. That increased supply had the potential of lowering price. It was one of the factors in lowering price. Now, what happened in the recent Trump sanctions? I believe they were anticipated to increase price, but right on the eve of the sanctions themselves, there were all sorts of exemptions made, big exemptions, which diminished the impact of these sanctions. Right? China was exempt. China's a huge market for oil, demand for oil. Same with India. China, India, Japan, South Korea, Italy, I think that's Greece, Greece, Turkey, and Taiwan all received exemptions, right? So that helped buffer or mitigate the impact of these sanctions. Or oil-producing nations could set embargoes against a big importing nation like the United States and other nations. They had embargoed in 1973, and that resulted in an oil crisis, decreasing supply, which raised price. Another political consideration is economic warfare. Well, these could be considered forms of economic warfare, right? Those are restricting production, all right? But economic warfare can be conducted through increasing productions. You can have overproduction to drive down price, and an example here is you can drive marginally profitable oil producers out of the market. For example, Saudi Arabia was trying to drive U.S. frackers out of the market, so they're overproducing, increasing production to drive down price below the point which frackers could be profitable. So to drive them into bankruptcy, drive them out of business, right? In the end, that didn't prove effective. Another example of overproduction as economic warfare was during the Iran-Iraq War. You had the key players in that war was, of course, Iran and Iraq. Iran being Shia and Iraq being Sunni. Now, other Sunni nations nearby, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, were supporting Iraq in defense against Shia Islam. And they're giving big loans to Iraq, allowing transport of weapons to their countries and so forth, right? Also, they're conducting economic warfare. They were overproducing oil to increase their share of revenues with which they can give loans to Iraq. But at the same time, they're driving down oil price, which is cutting into the revenues of Iran, right? So they're trying to bankrupt Iran, and of course, revenues, wealth is the fundamental means of financing a war. Okay, so EFG. Gee, so another factor that can affect supply, of course, is the world known oil reserve volume, right? But it's not just the world reserve volume itself, it's the production capacity of each individual nation. And generally, only Saudi Arabia it has a considerable excess production capacity. All right, they have a huge production capacity in excess of what they're producing. Now, I put here, as far as known oil reserves, there's believed to be the largest oil reserves under the Arctic ice, which could be made available as global warming melts the Arctic ice. All right. Now, it's not just world oil reserves which can affect supply, but also the political structure and laws within the country that govern business, investment, market mechanisms, and the economy as a whole. Venezuela is an example. They have the largest known reserves on land, but they have a broken production capacity. And another factor is when economies are heavily dependent upon oil export, right? So when that occurs, that increases their price vulnerability. If their economies are like highly one-dimensional and highly dependent upon oil export industries, their I guess well-being is highly affected by whether price goes up or price goes down for oil. And one of the factors that causes this is something called a Dutch disease. When a country has a highly profitable resource, right, they tend to throw all effort and energies into the resource and tend to neglect other means of productivity, right? And then they become highly dependent upon that one thing, and at the same time highly vulnerable to the vicissitudes of price, right? And then you can result, this is compounded by the fact that in the case of countries like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, they are essentially social welfare states, right? And if the economy goes bad, then the revenues they have to support the population diminishes because the population is not self-sufficient in a sense, right? That results in a lot of national debt, a lot of poverty, unemployment. And this happens in quite a few of the OPEC nations, right? Including the ones in Africa, oil-producing countries in Africa, heavily dependent upon oil production, and if prices go down, then there could be a lot of poverty, a lot of unemployment, and that results in political instability, and this can result in a demand to overproduce oil, which to increase revenues, but this only drives down oil price further. So you're kind of like stuck in a catch-22 there. All right, so that's HI. Where's I? Another example is social welfare state, but also that this whole welfare state in the case of Saudi Arabia led to big bills they had to pay, but also they had war debt. Plus they also had lavish spending on military weapons, right? And this again increased their demand to pump oil, right? So increased supply, it drove down price. HIJ. So another political consideration is oil import quota restrictions decreased domestic supply in the domestic market, but increased supply in the world market, right? HIJK. You can also have restrictions on export of domestic oil. For example, United States between 1973 and 2016 had a law in the books which prevented export of crude oil. All right, that was taken off the books during the Obama administration. So when this happened, right, this is going to, of course, diminish domestic supplies of oil, which can increase prices of oil and gas and so forth, right? It can also relieve pressure on the market price of oil, the world market price of oil. HIJKL. So another factor is cartels like OPEC, which control production levels. It's a cartel that sets production quotas, right, to restrict production, to increase price, to increase the profits. That affects the supply and subsequently the price. LM. Busting OPEC. So if OPEC is a problem, like Admiral Woolsey said, director of the CIA, that busting OPEC could have an impact, right? And I say global warming. So as the world is warming, largely due to hydrocarbon release, burning fossil fuels, that's resulting in polar ice melt, and this polar ice is diminishing rapidly. There's a rapid decrease in polar ice, and this is increasing access to potentially huge Arctic sea oil. So they believe right now, estimates are that the largest oil reserves in the world by far are under the Arctic, right? Now, the problem with the Arctic is you have seasonal ice. I mean, during the wintertime, you have basically no sunlight up there, right? So it gets very cold, and ice grows, and the ice shifts, right? It's not locked down. It's moving, and it's growing and receding during the summertime. Now, this movement of ice and the growth and recession of ice, that can cause problems for oil rigs, the technology required. But if that ice clears and it makes that oil accessible, this could be a huge source of oil, right? Increasing supply. HIJKN. Oh, okay. So government price controls are another factor. Oh, I'm forgetting one here. I'm forgetting these. O is here. Okay. So another factor is reserves. Now, countries have national strategic reserves, like we have one. We have we try to maintain 90 days of oil in strategic reserves in case there is some crisis in which oil supplies are cut off, foreign oil supplies are cut off. Now, oil reserves can be drawn down upon, or they can be added to. All right. For example, let's say there's some big inflationary pressure, and maybe the president or whatever wants to release more oil. He can draw down upon the reserves. That would cause an infusion of oil into the market, right? Helping reduce price. Oil companies also have their own reserves. A lot of times they hold them in tanks or in oil tankers themselves. Unused oil tankers. They can buy or sell oil for whatever financial reason on the market. There will be with these there will be a short-term impact upon oil supply as reserves are either drawn down upon or built up. All right. Oftentimes they build them up when oil is cheap. Oil price is cheap. You increase your reserves while the getting is good. LPQ. Government price controls is another factor, and this was happening in the 1970s under Nixon. Nixon was dealing with a lot of inflation problems, right? Largely due to the war in Vietnam, and also due to trying to fight the war simultaneous with the war on poverty. Johnson's Great Society. Anyways, that caused a lot of inflationary pressure, right? So Nixon tried to control inflation with price controls. Also, another thing he did is in 71, well, this is kind of off to the side, but in 1971, he went off the gold standard. That was called the gold shock, yeah. So basically what happened was, just kind of a short, simple explanation of it. Again, the Vietnam War, and combined with the Great Society, war on poverty, and no conservation during the war, no rationing, whatever, right? Trying to run the economy as normal while we're fighting a major scale war, right? Caused a lot of inflationary pressures. Now, during that time, we were in a financial system called the Bretton Woods Agreement, in which to stabilize currencies, to prevent especially aggressive devaluation of currencies and so forth, right? That occurred before World War II, and to stabilize the flow of currency and goods. They established a Bretton Woods system in which the dollar was pegged to gold and all the other currencies were pegged to the dollar to create stability and increase interchangeability, exchange between currencies to promote economic exchange transactions. And during the system with the U.S. dollar inflating, that means the dollar value is decreasing rapidly. Now, according to the agreement, other members of this agreement, they had to maintain their currencies within 3% of the par value with the dollar. So if the dollar value was falling, right, then they had to devalue their currency. They devalued their currency by printing more currency and then using that currency to purchase dollars. So they were building up their dollar reserves, and essentially what was happening was it was a transfer of wealth, right? Our big bills, right, were being financed by devaluing currency, and those devalued dollar bills had to be purchased by these other countries. So in a sense, they were bankrolling our excessive, deficit payment spending. And so they got all pissed off, and also at the same time, the gold, the actual valuable gold, now exceeded the dollar exchange, the $35 per ounce of gold. So both the combination of national banks, like the French National Bank, and also there were also bank syndicates. They started cashing in their chips, their devalued dollars for gold. Right, so there was basically a run on U.S. gold reserves, and gold reserves were being depleted rapidly. So Nixon panicked and took us off the gold standard right away in 1971. But then another thing happened with, especially with the inflation of the OPEC embargo, right? Nixon set up what's called the petrodollar, which was an agreement by first Saudi Arabia, then all other OPEC nations to sell oil exclusively in exchange for dollars. Now, the purpose of this was twofold: to increase demand for dollars, which would help maintain dollar value, which would help stem off inflation, and also to recycle currency, they believed, back to the United States, so that we don't have a currency shortage and rising interest rates. Right, so dollar value, petrodollar, that was a factor, right? Now, given the fact that there's a petrodollar, and given the fact that, that a dollar is primarily purchased, the oil is primarily purchased with dollars, that means the value of the dollar has a huge importance. If the value of the dollar goes up, then oil prices go down. Right, so that's currently one of the factors in today's current fall in oil prices. There's a number of factors. The big factor, of course, is the global economy. But so this is a factor. For example, let's say there's inflation or threat of inflation in the United States. The economy is running, at a high rate, and the Fed wants to ward off inflation. So the Fed may increase interest rates. Okay, as interest rates goes up, right now. I'm not a student of global money markets, whatever, but I'm just imagining that there's in global money markets, I'm sure there's an index arbitrage. You have computerized trading of currencies, right? And what happens is you're going to have different central banks with different policies. If the U.S. starts jacking up the interest rates, all right. And let's say other banks, like the Bank of Japan, which is running negative interest rates, all right. So what happens is, as the U.S. raises their interest rates, that's going to create a high demand for U.S. dollars. All right. So a lot of foreign currency, the loans will be taken out where they're cheap. Let's say in Japan, where you get loans cheap, and then those yen, whatever, are being sent to the United States to purchase dollars, right? To purchase federal securities, and to make money that way. And what happens is that increases the dollar value, and the increase in dollar value, as the dollar gets stronger, well, then the price of oil goes down, right? Okay, so dollar value goes down, oil price goes up. In the other direction. All right, so that's another factor. QRS. Oh, the big factor here, global economy, is the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room. It's a big factor in both oil price and demand, right? As the economy goes up, oil demand goes up, price goes up, right? As the economy goes down, oil demand goes down, price goes down. Okay. all these factors are filtered through the futures market. They're making estimates on what the Fed's going to do. They're trying to make guesses on what the economy is going to do. And currently, oil prices are dropping. They're pretty low, largely due to anticipation that there's going to be there is a global slowdown, but an increased recession. And a lot of this is being gauged upon whether or not there's going to be a trade agreement between China and the U.S., right? All right, so that can happen. Filtered through futures markets, all these factors can be filtered through there. They can, depending upon what factors they take into account. That depends upon the individual, traders. All right, STU. So now oil price can be a factor, and let's say oil price goes up, right? If oil price goes up, investments. All right, so what I say, that can affect investment. Increase oil prices. You have more investment to install more rigs, right? To take advantage of the higher price. All right. If oil prices go down, well, there could be investment scramble to search for increased production process efficiencies to lower your costs, right? So that you can stay in business and survive, right? Either way, that can cause more investment. Either way, you can get new technologies for oil exploration and increased extraction, right? And with these new technologies, you can have access to hitherto inaccessible oil. For example, all the tight shale oil wasn't accessible until fracking technology was developed, right? So you have increased access to difficult to extract oil like deep sea oil or tight oil, the shale oil, which was acquired through fracking. Arctic oil now, which has the restriction of variable ice sheets, moving ice sheets. Canadian oil sands, which I think can be problematic because all of the hydrocarbon has to be burned to release that oil from the sands. This could be a problem, but that's a source of oil. Now, increased oil prices encourages development of marginally profitable oil fields. All these frackers are making decisions. I mean, I don't know their exact decision process, but it's all dependent upon price, right? And what their production capacity is and production costs are, and how they can streamline, make things more efficient, and stay in business. What fields they have to shut down, and what can they rely upon to survive, to weather the storms of lower prices, all right? Okay. All that can affect supply, and then that affects the price. Another factor here, what have I got to here? Okay, new technologies. So new technologies to increase fuel efficiencies and conservation to decrease demand. So fuel efficiencies of vehicles, increase fuel efficiency, also increase conservation methods. For example, home heating, better insulation, better standards and codes and whatnot. The Tyvek wrap and all that stuff to reduce airflow. Limits to internal combustion engine efficiencies, right? So you can try to increase efficiencies, but there's pretty stiff limits. We've pretty much tapped out the efficiencies in internal combustion engines. But I have an arrow here showing that the increased growth potential of technology in electric vehicles is huge, right? This is wide open compared to internal combustion. This is the way of the future here. Another national policy here is taxes on oil consumption. I know, for example, European taxes heavily on oil consumption. Now, this can have the effect of reducing demand, right? The higher the tax, the more expensive the gasoline. Maybe the increased demand for fuel efficient cars, lower power, smaller cars, whatever, right? Instead of the big US SUVs running around in the United States. But also increased fuel costs could be an increased input costs for businesses that are dependent upon transportation, and this could cut into the competitiveness of companies. Right, so this is kind of a balance you play here. You get increased revenues, but at the same time, you increase costs, which can make your companies more inefficient, less competitive in a world market. Um, Another factor that affects demand is winter temperatures, right? Of course, as winter temperatures go down, there's increased demand for heating oil and so forth, right? So they'll affect demand, right? And this is a big factor in futures markets. So they're predicting what the weather's going to be. Um, Alternative fuels, alternative fuels, for example, biodiesel, whatever, could decrease demand for oil if that ramps up. Alternative energies, this is going to be a bigger factor here, especially electricity, electric vehicle technology, um, electric vehicle technology, battery is highly dependent upon battery technology, right? There's huge growth potential here, right? Key limiting factors right now are battery range, charge time, battery life. But again, this is a huge, wide open area for development of new technologies. All right, fast charging batteries, batteries that have a longer range than gasoline engine cars. You know, you're talking 500-600 miles possibly, right? Maybe more than that. And charge times, you know, they're working on solid state, they're working on graphene-based batteries, right? That have rapid charge times. I think who was it? Fisker announced that they had a 500-mile battery that can be recharged in 10 minutes. I don't know if it's cost prohibitive at this point, right? And I don't know how long that battery lasts, how effective that battery is, whatever. But yeah, alternative energies and electric vehicles, I believe, are the way of the future. Not only that, I believe they're going to be a huge economic engine for growth. As we convert the energy production over to renewable energies, that's a huge area for growth. But also electric vehicles and all the infrastructure required, and other new developments that you can get with charging facilities and so forth, right? Which will create jobs and whatever. All right, so these are some of the factors in oil price. Now we'll finish up. We're almost done here with this. I'll stop at this point here. So we said bottom line is oil has a huge impact upon our economy, whether as a fuel for transportation or as the building blocks for the chemical industry, right? Virtually all the material in this world is made of oil, unless it's just, you know, basic, real natural products, wood and so forth, glass. Now, I want to turn back to the 1973 and 1979 oil shocks, which whacked our economy, and to assess how we coped with that, and how did we turn the tables on the oil-producing countries. All right. So we said there's 5 ways of dealing with a lack of power, a lack of leverage. Right. Find an alternative source of supply. Eliminate or reduce your need for the other person's commodity. Find alternative commodities to replace his. Acquire something he needs to improve your bargaining power in exchange. Create within the other person or party a need or demand for something you possess already. So number 1, find an alternative source of supply. Well, this happened in the 1970s. Alaskan oil was developed about the same time. I guess it started actually in the 60s, late 60s. Alaskan and North Sea oil developed. It really got ramped up in the 70s, right? Both of these are being depleted right now, are running out. But now U.S. fracking has kicked in, and this was a huge untapped source of oil, right? Especially in West Texas. There's large oil reserves there. So U.S. fracking became big, and that has allowed the United States to be the biggest producers of oil in the world. You don't think of the United States as being the biggest producer of oil. You think of like some Middle East country, like Saudi Arabia or whatever, right? Maybe Russia, but now it's the U.S. We've passed both of them. So this started becoming big about 2010, right? Now, a big new oil reserve, like I said, is Arctic Sea. This is something that's possible in the future. Eliminate or reduce your need for the other person's commodity. Well, one way of doing this was to institute conservation methods to reduce oil consumption. So you had increased home insulation, lower the thermostats. Maybe you have like a digitally controlled automatic thermostats, right? When you're away for the day at work, whatever, you lower the temperature and you lower it at night also. Improved building standards. They had Tyvek house wrap, right? So the idea is to decrease heating oil consumption. Right, and then for conservation, you also had increased gas mileage for cars and trucks. Well, you know, a lot of the automakers resist this because they make their big bucks on the large gas guzzling cars, the SUVs, and a lot of people, there's a market demand for those, right? So it's hard to deal with that. I think the big salvation is going to be once you get electric cars, batteries are very effective, right? Not just the range, not just the charge time, but you know also the life of the battery, you know, increasing that safety of batteries too. Find an alternative commodity to replace his, right? So we shift to shift electricity generation away from oil. There's very little bit of electricity generated from oil these days, right? Maybe 1%. Places that are limited like Hawaii, right, where you have to ship in hydrocarbons. Well, it's a lot cheaper to ship in hydrocarbons in the form of oil than in coal, right? And it's a lot easier to utilize than the coal. So natural gas is going to be liquefied natural gas. That can be expensive, right? So it's primarily oil in places that are isolated without hydrocarbon source. They're shifting heavily into solar, though. So shift from oil to nuclear to coal to natural gas to hydroelectric to wind and solar. All right, shift away. Shift from gasoline to other fuels like ethanol, biodiesel, natural gas, electric cars. All right, acquire something he needs to improve your bargaining power in exchange. Well, this isn't really possible because oil is purchased on a world market with currency, right? I mean, what are you going to get? You know, you're not going to be. It's not a barter system here, so this is not really feasible here. And the only example here I give is like the Food for Oil program during Iraq sanction era, right? Last is create within the other person a need, demand for something you possess. Now, this is the one that's going to be very controversial. A lot of people, I believe, are not going to want to believe this, right? But we're going to see what was actually done, and we'll go through the history of the oil industry and United States actions in the Middle East. All right. So use conflict and war to create demand for the weapons you manufacture. Also use divide and conquer in the Middle East to bust up OPEC as a cartel. All right. Now, I'm willing to bet that people are going to think, this is crazy, this is far-fetched, right? But don't forget, you got the director of the CIA saying, destroying OPEC should be the first priority of those in government. Well, the idea is, how do you destroy OPEC? How do you bust them up, right? In the United States, you bust them up with the Justice Department, right? You know, like Teddy Roosevelt trust busting era or whatever, right? And, you know, even more recently, the bust up of Microsoft, or, you know, before that, the bust up of Standard Oil, things like that, right? But this is on an international stage, and we don't have jurisdiction for that. So how do you bust up OPEC? All right, so we'll leave it at that for now. That's the end of this lecture. We'll pick it up with the history of the oil industry and the history of U.S. actions in the Middle East.